Hey, good news, everybody. Great news. The Lake George Association, in cahoots with the Lake George Park Commission, have successfully flushed Lake George for the spring of 2018. They're up there right now as the ice and snowpack are melting, and they're flushing that big old toilet just as big as they can possibly flush it to dilute all the chemicals and the sewage leachate that have contaminated Lake George, New York for, I don't know, about 2 centuries. You see, ladies and gentlemen, right now, today, all over Lake Champlain, there's this giant environmental mess. Zebra mussels, they've got all kinds of invasive species, they've got all kinds of sewage problems and chemical problems, and huge amounts of milfoil. Let's not forget the old milfoil. And giant gargantuan amounts of chemicals and garbage from the industries and the big agricultural operations that have flooded or have been flushed into Lake Champlain, going on 2 centuries plus now. Huge amounts of this garbage is coming up the Champlain-Hudson Canal, the ditch, the big ditch there from the Hudson River, where huge amounts of sewage and chemicals and just every imaginable toxic waste you can think of, including radioactive waste, is routinely dumped in the Hudson sewer, the Hudson cesspool. They call it the Hudson River, but really what it is it's a toxic river from hell. All brought to you by the big industries and the big financial schemers and scammers of the New York State bankster gangsters. Now, let's get back to Lake George. The big flusher. That's what it is, folks. It's been used for decades to flush the Poop Chute River, and everybody knows it, especially the senior lawyer for the Lake George Fund, the Lake George Association there, old Tom West from Dunham's Bay. Tom West is extremely familiar with the reality that the spring runoff and snowpack melt is used to not only generate a lot of money for the International Paper and Power Corporation and Systems Property and Enel Power, and now it's Green Mountain Power. They use the water from Lake George in a hydroelectric operation to generate large amounts of revenue for the International Paper Corporation and the investor class behind the penstock and the hydroelectrical generation system at the north end of Lake George. You see, every time they dump that lake and raise it and dump it and raise it and dump it and raise it during the wintertime ice sheet cover, during the spring melt when the big flush comes, and in the fall time when they flush the lake during the fall and winter drawdown. That's where they're making the bucks, because by statute, by law, there's no control over the up and down of Lake George, because the big bucks, the big investor class that control the mill pond. And I said that correctly. Lake George, the mill pond, is controlled by dam number 230, Dam A, owned and operated and supervised by the state of New York. Now, folks, when you take a real hard, long look, into just exactly who's been pocketing the money from operating the giant flusher, well, that would be the state. The jobs, the taxes, the revenues, the real estate and property and school taxes, all of the electrical generation that creates money and taxes and revenues. The state of New York and its partners dumping huge amounts of chemicals, huge amounts of sewage, huge amounts of mill waste, and of course flushing Lake George. That's what they do, folks. They flush Lake George from all of the brown fields. There's thousands of brown fields all around Lake George. They're called leach fields, septic systems, the brown fields of Lake George. That's what's turning Lake George green and into a milfoil mess. It's not the boats, it's it's the septic tanks. And Tom West, you know, I challenge anybody from the Lake George Association to a discussion of just exactly where all this watershed sheds to. And when you've got the brown fields and the septic tanks in the watershed, every single day that's gone on for decades and decades with all these septic tank leach fields all around Lake George, guess where all of that shit is going? Let's get real. Fund for Lake George. And Lake George Association, man, I tell you what, they got their pinkies up in the air, they got their nose up in the air. They are the elite, the white privileged elite that run Lake George like a giant homeowners association. They run that plantation. Welcome to the reservation, the Lake George Wild Forever Park. The park for the 1% investor class that, what did George Foster, oh yeah, George Foster Peabody used to call their houses the shacks of Lake George with the septic systems. Not like the Peabody Mansion up there on Millionaires Row. And especially Millionaires Row. All of that stuff on Millionaires Row, all that shit. And PP and chemicals and all the other stuff from Millionaires Row, all that stuff goes in the watershed and straight into Lake George as well. So ladies and gentlemen, I think I'll leave it right there. Andy Cuomo and Eric Schneiderman have a date in the United States Supreme Court with crazy old Judd. Crazy old Judd that grew up on Lake George. You see, folks, I actually am a Glens Falls Indian and a Lake George warrior with many decades background in industrial, institutional, commercial, military, and residential construction. Oh my Lord, the guy's kind of an expert on these issues. Folks, enjoy the Poisoning of Lake Champlain. It's expose on how the 1% poo-poo and pee-pee in Lake George, the Lachute Poop-Chute River, and Lake Champlain. And enjoy all the other entries and blogs and stories and links. There's huge numbers of links that provide the historical record of the flushing of all that crap from Lake George, the Poop-Chute River, and Lake Champlain. The Champlain-Hudson Canal, and of course, the Hudson River. Folks, as always, hasta la vista, God bless, and you betcha, we definitely will be back.